Welcome back to an episode of I'm Glad You're Here. Today's guest is Elizabeth Hudson, a spiritual life coach, a Kundalini yoga and meditation teacher, an inspirational speaker, a retreat leader, and the creator of Sexual Alchemy podcast. Elizabeth and I have a beautiful discussion on sacred sexuality, unpacking how we view sexuality as a society, as individuals, with so much conditioning, so much suppression and repressed expression in this space. We talk about the freedom that sexuality connects us to, the divine source that sexuality offers us, and how as a society we can shift from this viewpoint of disease when it comes to sexuality to a healthy outlook. Elizabeth talks about a philosophy of doing the inner work to then see how the outer world starts to change. Therefore, it starts with the individual. She offers compassionate space for deep spiritual transformation, trauma release, and real life upleveling that reframes our perspective to make sense of our soul's work here on earth. I'm super excited for this conversation. I think it's one of those where we can really start to shift our perspective on what we've learned and been conditioned to think around sexuality. So let's get on to the conversation. Let's dive in. Okay. Welcome to I'm Glad You're Here. This is super exciting because we're in person. We're going to be talking about sex, so extra exciting. And Elizabeth, would love to have you introduce yourself. I know you're a jack of many trades. So if you could just let the listeners know what you're up to these days.
Yeah, thank you, Molly. I'm so glad to be here. I'm Elizabeth Hudson. I am a mother of two. I'd like to start with that. I am a spiritual coach and teacher. So a mindfulness teacher, Kundalini yoga specifically, and meditation. And I'm the creator of the Sexual Alchemy podcast, which is about exploring sacred, conscious, and healed sexuality in all its forms and really having a conversation about sexuality and spirituality.
Beautiful. And we're new to each other, and it's been so lovely getting to know you. I'm in your book club on Mondays. I get to hear your wisdom. We're doing The Artist's Way, which for those listening, if you haven't heard, it's a beautiful, creative 12-week journey. Really helpful to have a support group through it. Yes. So very grateful to you and to Corey who lead these sessions. I also attended a recent workshop of yours, and this was the part 2 of a 3-part series. If you want to just talk through that, and I can share my experience after so we can kind of grab into that. Yeah.
So I use the podcast as a platform for workshops, teaching, coaching, but I created this 3-series workshop that starts with release, a process of letting go, of restoring, and rejoicing. So it's starting with what do we need to let go in terms of shame, in terms of guilt, in terms of old programming around our sexuality. Maybe there's trauma, maybe there's something even deeper that needs to be let go before we can start to celebrate and be in a more conscious space. The second workshop is about restoration. What do we need to rebuild, and how can we do that? Using the tools of Kundalini yoga, which is movement and mantra, chanting and breath work and meditation. And then the last one is about rejoicing, because ultimately our sexuality is a celebration of life. It's a celebration of our creative energy and our heart center. And when it's in that space and when it's coming from a healed space, I truly believe our humanity will evolve. It sounds like a huge, bold statement, but I think it's very true. There's so much pain in our collective sacral chakra. There's so much confusion and discord. And my goal is to really, as much as possible, to, first of all, point it out, to call it out. And, you know, as you made the point earlier, there's very little conversation in the spiritual community about sexuality, right? So we'll differentiate spirituality versus religion, right?
Yeah.
There's certainly, in most world religions, rules, regulations, restrictions, dogma around sexuality and how it should be, right? And controlling it, etc. But if we're taking spirituality, which is ideally dogma-free, it's really about your own journey and finding that for yourself. How can we reconsider it? How can we look at our sexuality as the most beautiful aspect of ourselves, as a communion with God?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I hear what you're saying, because we talk about healing in terms of the shame we feel in childhood, triggers, things that come up. And it's easier these days to talk about that when it doesn't relate to something that is shame centered. And so sexuality feels very suppressed in society, that's behind closed doors. We don't talk about it. Or if we do, it's what we see in pornography or on the TV. Like, oh yeah, that's what's acceptable. So that's the framework that we can go with. And when we were first speaking, and I was thinking, this is so important, because even in my experience, when I go to a place to receive a sound bath or healing, we're talking about the chakras, and we touch on the sacral chakra, and it's like this skim over, like, okay, yes, this is important. It's where your reproductive organs are, and, sex. Okay, so that means creativity. And we're just going to talk about creativity and not even talk about the sex part. And I understand a lot of people aren't trained to talk about sex. It's uncomfortable because people have a lot of entanglements with that word. And so I'm really excited to unpack that in this conversation and just get to this core essence. If sex is creativity, how can we build that trust muscle more?
Yeah. And as we were saying, like, sexual is such a triggering word because it is so layered and it's so taboo and yet also exploited. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's really navigating the space that we're in culturally. And obviously we're all coming from different backgrounds and different, familiar backgrounds, religious backgrounds, culture, media, etc. But to really look at us collectively, where is our sexual health, right? Where is the way that we relate to ourselves sexually? And I would argue that it's really kind of sick. There's a lot of unhealthiness around the way we look at sexuality. And what I mean by that is it's not a judgment. It's more about we're counterbalancing what seems like a formerly very repressive society around sexuality, right?
Yeah.
With almost pornification, over exploitation, over
swinging that pendulum the exact opposite way. Yeah.
And, in any cultural shift, there's always the pendulum swing that eventually brings us back to a little more of a medium. But there is the, with the access that we have to the internet and the way that's changed sexual culture is massive, right?
Yeah.
And so there's so much, and this is a conversation I've had in my podcast, but that there's so much overexposure at an early age, which isn't about intimacy, right? Then it becomes a very abstract concept when, adolescents, teenagers are learning about sex through porn versus their first kiss and their first fondle, right?
Right.
It's a very different, like suddenly now there's graphic and unfortunately dark versions of sexuality that are readily available. That is such a massive shift from anything we have ever experienced as human beings before in our collective history.
Yeah.
And so what do we do with that? How do we process that? Where is the sacred? Where is the heart in that, right? And it's not even about judging it, but if you really look statistically at the people who are doing it and the exploitation involved in it, and, there's all sorts of arguments around power and control over your own body that can be involved in that conversation. But my goal is really for every individual, start a dialogue about what were you taught about sexuality?
Yeah.
Was there shame? Was there guilt involved in that basic foundation, right? Was there sexual trauma? That's at least 1 in 3 is what we know statistically.
Oh, yeah.
And how do we start to undo religious teachings of like original sin, right? Of the idea that there's something inherently wrong with our sexual nature, right? That there's a sin aspect to it. And so then if we start to reconsider, if we accepted that on some level in our subconscious, on some level, we believe our very creation is bad, for lack of a better word. There's something wrong with us.
Wow. That's really powerful. If we talk about our subconscious and how that guides us and how we show up to everything. So a lot of manifestation, a lot of neuroscience is backed by our subconscious beliefs. And so if that is tainted by this image that what we create is shameful, is bad, is against what we're supposed to do, how are we supposed to produce? How are we supposed to be these powerful human beings that we can be?
It's a lie.
Wow.
It's a lie to believe that your sexual energy is bad, naughty, wrong, sinful, right? But so how do we bring consciousness and connection to the heart center? I'm going to keep coming back to that, into the sacral chakra, into the genitals, let's call it out, and our exchange of energy, right? And so the more consciously we are connected to our sacral, that is not a coincidence. That is the word sacral, because that is the source of creation. It's sacred. That part of our interaction, we realize it is a portal. And when we connect through that energy, there is incredibly expansive energy that's potentially available to us.
Yeah.
It's about what we do with it, right? And so in that space, if you're showing up without shame, without fear, without, some inherent sense of wrongness in a sacred and conscious relationship, the alchemy, in the word of my, podcast, what is alchemy is transmutation. So we can use sexual energy to transform on a deeply powerful level the way that we see our humanity.
Yeah. I have so many questions I want to ask you, but one I'm really curious about. I'm curious how you arrived here, what your journey into this space was.
Yeah. I struggled with that a bit in terms of my own journey and the way I related to my sexuality. I had sexual trauma at a young age. I do believe that everything comes with a gift in it to some degree.
Yeah.
And what that did for me is it opened up a lot of my psychic abilities. It opened up a lot of my empath abilities. It opened up a lot of creative space that maybe I wouldn't have had access to. I don't know, right? The ability to kind of go out of my body. Okay, so that's something that psychologists will talk about. There's a defense mechanism. When a child's in trauma, they go out, right? So it's a disassociation. There's trauma in that, but there's also a gift. And the gift is, so when I can go out and connect to those ethereal realms, there is some benefit to that. I understand how to now bring in a higher vibration. I'm connected to something. And then along the way, developing my own connection with sexuality as a spiritual teacher and going like, okay, what part of myself feels hypocritical here, right? What is right? So how can I be deeply sexual and spiritual in a community that's like, oh, we don't talk about that, or that's,
that's wrong. That's too much power. That's this.
Yeah. And a lot of that is fear of the feminine. A lot of that is that cultural misogyny. There's so little we understand about the feminine because, still they're trying to figure out menopause. They don't really get it. They don't understand what it is.
We're too complex.
And living through it, I'll tell you, it's all a massive mystery. But as the feminine energy, we're going to talk about polarity, right? The masculine and the feminine. And obviously there's, acceptance and love for all, everything in between and everything that people are experiencing as human beings that are nuances, right, of shades of gray within that. But the feminine in particular is a portal. We literally bring in souls from other dimensions through our bodies into this world. There is nothing closer to God than that. And so to hold that space as the feminine is to hold that divine mystery and to be the embodiment of that. And, ultimately when we see the exploitation or degradation or ownership and control, which is a lot of what religion has done to sexuality, so much of it is aimed at the female, right? And then how do we reconsider that? And how do we, as spiritual women who need to take charge of that narrative in some way, step up and feel brave enough to be like, I'm going to call out that a lot of what we've accepted as normal is not. It's actually not okay. And then how do we change that narrative? We have to have these conversations. How do you show up in your sexual life as a holy woman, as a holy man, as a holy being, and be able to live in that space and not feel like, oh, well, that's this compartmentalized version of myself for the bedroom that I can't embody fully.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean that you have to dress for somebody else or behave in a way in the world, which I feel like, I'm navigating teenagers right now. What is acceptable? What is self-respect versus what is seeking validation? Right.
Right.
That's
Like
a
what is
whole
doing
other
something.
conversation.
Yeah. I so relate to what you're saying right now because throughout my spiritual journey, this is a discovery of self, of collective, how we all take part in this bigger metaphor. We're all collaborators, and how you called out before, seeing sex as the sickness that we're experiencing with it because we're not embracing it fully. There's so much so many places I want to go with it, but a big one, a vulnerable one, I'd like to talk about orgasms because I've been with my partner for a few years, and what I've seen in my personal journey with the two of us is it was very easy for me to be open initially and sexually. And over time, or transitions or things are coming up, I felt, ooh, this is highly vulnerable. I don't know if I can fully be present in this space, or I don't know what I want from us, for me, and navigating that and feeling all this pressure of, oh, well, it was this way once, it needs to continue. And throughout my spiritual connection, it's been really cool to see how it shows up between us, for me. And it feels like a very spiritual connection. An orgasm feels like what you're saying, that portal, that openness, that expansive, this is beyond the human experience, a little tingle of outside of our normal touch, sight experience.
It's been called le petit mort, right? The little death, right? Because it shatters our container, right? Of being in our ego and being in the limitation of being a finite body. And it reminds us of that expansive, infinite version of ourselves. And that's why it feels so good. And what I've come to learn on my own spiritual journey is that ultimately that is the truth. That feeling is the infinite self, the limited version of our pain body that we have to experience in the third dimension that has, pleasure and pain, but also has the pain of separation. And so that's some of why it is so difficult to be human, because we do know on a soul level in our hearts that we are all connected, that we are unified in the cosmic field. When we are in that soul state, in our higher self, we know the truth, right? That we are all one, that it is all this expansive, loving God that we come from and we go back to, right? So we come into these finite bodies for a limited time to have experiences and opportunities to refine our soul. But the orgasm is that great release, that great reminder of what we really are. And when we can use that in our physical state to manifest, to connect from the heart to another human being, there's, again, expansive energy created.
So is that what you're talking about? Because you love this heart space. And I think for me, for a lot of us, it's very easy to be in the head space because work rewards that. Life is just suited for mind and science and academia.
Sure.
So dropping into the heart space, experiencing orgasm, obviously you can have that on your own. It also happens a lot in partnership. So I'm curious, is that because that's tapping into the heart space? It's reminding us of collective, or how does that kind of relate to our expansiveness and then relationship with other?
In terms of the orgasm, or
I guess I'm curious. So one, when we talk about general spirituality, a Kundalini practice, going to receive a sound bath, kind of going through your own trauma releases, and that feels very personal and it helps you relate to others, but you're experiencing that on your own. So I'm curious what the relationship is, how we can connect that to the orgasm, where oftentimes that happens in partnership.
Sure. To be able to show up better in partnership, you've ideally done a lot of the work on your own. masturbation is great. Ways of relating to your sensuality. A sensuality in general is a deeper embodiment of the love of yourself, which you're then going to be able to show up more fully healed in partnership. And ideally, the best partnerships are those people who've done their own work. I always say when I counsel and coach couples, just to be clear, there's nothing more difficult in the human experience than being in partnership, because it's easier to go sit in a cave and meditate, right? But to be able to show up every day with that intimacy, with a mirror who mirrors back to you maybe the things you don't want to face in yourself and triggers you and all that stuff, that is exponential growth. And to be able to do that and show up for it, it's why relationships are so hard, right? And it's deeply courageous. And what I heard you saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea that like once you're really intimate with someone, it almost becomes harder just to have that, orgasm or get off or have that, fun. Because suddenly it's like, oh gosh, you really know me and you know all of me. And even the unsexy parts.
You've seen it all.
Right? And then, but that's really deep intimacy, right? And that's like next level of love. Right? Versus a fantasy or infatuation or a, projection.
Totally. And a big reason why I even feel like I can have this conversation or start to really connect with everything you're saying is I got very lucky in this world. I met an amazing partner, and just in day to day in our lives and all the stuff that comes up, the way that we tackle the world is beautiful, really, really beautiful. And it's helped me explore that sexual component where, it's easy in the beginning for me because you see things growing up, you relate, you're just getting to know each other, you're building out that vulnerability, and then you're really seen. And then you're really vulnerable. And then this person really knows you and you're making that eye contact and you really see each other, and it can be very overwhelming. And that feeling took a long time for me to be like, oh, that feels good. At first it was overwhelming. It was scary. It was, I don't want to surpass
it's exposing.
This. Very exposing. And now this journey, I really feel like it's a place to play and grow. And of course, more will come up. And like you said, we're mirrors of each other. So the things you don't want to deal with, this person will naturally present to you. And it's a constant reminder back to that expansiveness, because if we were walking around with that portal open all the time, we wouldn't be human.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to reframe the way you said something, and if you would reconsider it this way, because I always take issue with the word lucky. And I always try to reframe it as fortunate.
I love that.
Because lucky almost implies randomness.
Yeah, totally.
And you need to know that there's no coincidences, that you attracted this partner because you were ready and it was aligned for your soul. So, and I love that.
I appreciate that, because as I was thinking
it's those subtle things that we need to like reframe in the way we consider it, because on some level we're, it's not random. It's not just you happened into it,
Yeah. I'm grateful you said that, because it's truly how I feel. The timing that we met each other, the person that I'm with, the way we show up because of each other is not coincidental. And it's completely reshaped my life, his life. And it's beautiful. I think I felt a lot of discomfort owning that. Like, I'm not lucky. I was ready, and he was ready, and we found each other because of that.
Exactly. Or even more than ready, I'm deserving.
Worthy.
I'm a manifester.
One
thing that was coming to me in the moment is the idea that like there's so much self-hatred that goes on in human sexuality, it seems. It's often the downfall of people, right? Like if you want to take a man down, you find, just put a camera in the wrong room and he's caught in the act, and then you can, unravel whatever politician or, but really, why is that? And it's not because we just can't control ourselves. There's some self-fulfilling prophecy of shame that is an underlying theme that we carry as humanity. And it's a lie. There is no shame in pleasure. There is no shame in seeking connection. There's no shame in enjoying ourselves and enjoying our physical body. We've been given this physical body. You know, there's a wonderful old movie, I'm going to forget the name of it, but it's basically the idea that angels envy our physical form, that they have this, you know, infinite consciousness, but there is this wonderful beauty of being in a human body to get to enjoy sensations and food and sexuality and the breeze and the water on our skin. And so if we can fully embrace that, how would that be different? How would we see our basic humanity in a more enlightened way, a more embodied way?
Yeah.
That we don't have to be, but on the side, I'm, you know, kinky.
I do this, right? Or I have these relations. And I so see that. And I'm hearing that the more we suppress, the more we restrict, if they act on it, it's, oh, well, I've been told this is bad, so I need to hide it. I need to find a source. It becomes addiction. It becomes this perversion. I can't trust myself and what feels good to me. I'm told by the world that it's wrong.
That's huge, what you just said. I can't trust myself, right? That we're taught on some level, or we've agreed to on some level, that my basic drive is something I can't trust in myself. Right. And then what do you do with that? Right. So then in some way it gets distorted. Right. So if you look at the huge outpouring of sexual abuse in something like the Catholic Church, like that's just not a coincidence. It's because something natural has been suppressed and then it comes out in a dark way. In terms of popular culture, I laugh sometimes. I'm like, when did I become like the church lady with my beliefs about, I listen to songs and I'm like, how much more graphic could you possibly be? Right?
Like in lyrics of songs.
Yeah, in lyrics.
Totally. I recognize that too.
You know, and sometimes it's, when is enough enough, right? And it's not about being prudish. It's not about being judgmental even. It's just about like, is that a celebration or is it a degradation on some level? You know, and that's kind of an interesting conversation to have, right? Is it empowering to talk about WAP, right? Wet Ass Pussy, which was one of like the most popular song ever. Like, I mean, you know, for that year, it was about the number one song.
Yeah.
And it was about as graphic as you possibly can get. Yeah. And my kids knew all the lyrics and they were like 12, 13
they're
years
just
old.
reciting it. Yeah.
And I was like, good Lord, this is actually disturbing, you know?
Yeah.
Because it's not appropriate. Yeah. It's not age appropriate, certainly, for them to be singing it.
What I hear in that too, though, is the intention behind that song is not educational. It's not self-love. It's not embracing the parts of you, that your sexual wisdom. It's let's exploit this.
Yeah. And that's an interesting discussion. And I've done a podcast about that, arguing like, well, the guest was saying it's women celebrating their sexuality, because if men are going to talk about their big swing and you know what, women are going to talk about their, and I'm like, but my concern or question would be, but is that empowerment? Is it? Yeah. Or is it just complicit in your own exploitation, right? Like, is it Stockholm syndrome, which is like, you don't even recognize that you're being exploited. And so you do it to yourself too. Yeah.
And it also feels more like a reaction. Oh, well, here's what's out there. So I'm going to meet it where it's at. That's a different vibration.
Exactly. And then it's dropping everybody down to a very base, right?
Right. So now here's the new level.
Right. Lowest common denominator, which is just like, can you go any lower? I don't know. Like, what more could you say?
Right.
And so the point about that is really about how do we live with dignity around our sexuality without repression? Because that's what we haven't really seen necessarily enough, right? That we came from a culture where it was like taboo to talk about. It was restrictive. The idea of original sin, the idea of sexuality is shameful and something that you have to kind of keep hidden and not talk about, to the pornification, which is the exploitation, right? Yeah. Or the rise in pedophilia, the rise in all sorts of exploitation. What is going on in our culture that we're so sick in the sacral chakra? There is something missing with our connection with God. And it's not okay. And enough is enough. And we have to come in and heal that part of ourselves and understand that we are portals of divine energy. And when we use that energy consciously, we are ultimately being in celebration with God, not the opposite.
Yeah.
It's not about engaging in shame or dark energy or using another person's body for your own pleasure.
Right. So how do we start to navigate that? How do we say, okay, this is what's out there. These are all the things I've heard. These are all the things I've been through. These are the things my parents, my generation has taught me. How do we decondition and come to our own sacral chakra and say, this is the kind of healing I need. This is the kind of work I'm willing to do.
Right.
Where do we start?
Well, we start by calling it out in conversations like this, right? We start by giving people tools to consider their own sexuality as beautiful and sacred, and by aligning spirituality and sexuality. And that's really something that I feel like has not been done enough.
Right. I agree.
And if you study some of the more maybe controversial or, interesting perspectives of Jesus Christ in terms of the Magdalene manuscript, have you ever heard of that? Or the idea that Mary Magdalene was in fact Jesus's partner, not one of his disciples and a prostitute, and all the ways that she's been rewritten. But the idea that there was this sacred partnership, that through the sexual alchemy of their lovemaking, she helped him expand his Ka body, which is his light body in Egyptology. And that was how he was able to resurrect. That truly, when we unite our spirituality and sexuality, and from a conscious place, we are capable of so much more than we ever even imagined.
Wow.
Right? And that's the rejoicing in it. So we got to start with the releasing.
Yeah.
We got to go move to the restoration. And then we need to really be in a space of celebration. That celebration isn't necessarily free porn for everybody. Right?
Yeah.
It's about deeply loving, committed partnerships, but starting from a place of deep self-love. And that's an individual journey for each of us. But we have to start to call out the collective sickness in order to heal it.
Yeah. Yeah. And something that just came to mind, I wanted to ask, for someone who's doing a lot of this inner work and a lot of healing and wanting to also have a great relationship with their sexuality, and they're in partnership, how can one start to invite that into this space with their partner and take, their own healing and try to cultivate a healthier sacral connection?
It's a really good question. The hard thing in relationship is always wanting our partner to be on the same page as us, right? You have to believe what I believe or it's not going to work.
My Kool-Aid.
God damn it, right? And that's really tough because everybody's on their own path and has their own timetable to what their healing process looks like. One of the best answers to that is do your own work.
Yeah.
Do your own work.
Yeah.
Because by example, you show up better, and that by osmosis inspires.
Yeah.
We can nag and nudge and push. And what I found in my relationships is when I just do the work and I show up better and brighter, and they're like, I want some of that.
Right.
What are you doing? Right.
Yeah. And it's attractive. It's, I can change. I can loosen up a little bit. Okay.
Right. And even just by your healing more deeply in yourself, yes, it may inspire your partner to do more, but it doesn't matter so much as because you're going to show up more whole. There's going to be less arguments. You're going to be less reactive. You're less likely to be triggered by them. And there's just going to be more harmony in general. I do think that there's times when relationships come to completion. They don't have to be tragedies. It just means like, okay, well, what we were brought together to do has completed, and that's okay. But ideally, in a partnership, there's a continual evolution, right? That both partner is seeking to grow and change and do their own work and do their own healing. And then, you can exponentially build from there.
Yeah. The feeling I'm getting is almost this like deep exhale of like a reminder that it's not black and white, that it's not, this is what we signed up for. This is what life looks like. This is my sexuality. I'm stuck here. It's all gray. It's all an exploration. It's kind of liberating to think about it with such play with such a child observer mindset of, oh, I get to learn about myself this way. I get to evolve. I get to show up differently. If my partner starts to, great. If not, that's information. And just going with that.
Right.
Yeah.
And what if you reconsider lovemaking or sexual activity as worship?
Ooh.
As devotion, as a space of opening up really high portals of energy, high vibrational energy that you're now incorporating in yourself. So truly, when we are relaxed, when we're in pleasure, we can start to relate to higher frequencies. Right. And so one thing that I saw, this wonderful experiment, I can't remember, on social media somewhere, but basically it was showing how different frequencies can't affect each other because they're not in the same alignment. But if the same frequency, let's say on a tuning fork, is vibrating next to another tuning fork tuned to the same frequency, the ball next to it on a string will start to bounce.
Right. Yeah.
Now, if it were not the same, nothing moves. And so too, when we raise our frequency, we attract differently, we flow differently. There's less resistance between us and what is, right? But our sexual pleasure is really a portal to that. It's really a way of remembering that we are expansive, infinite beings, temporarily enclosed in our beautiful little bodies that we get to experience and share.
Wow. That was really beautiful. Really beautiful. And I want to ask this question. I don't want it to take away from the essence of what we're saying. But what's coming up that I didn't want to forget to ask is going back to the idea of sexual trauma and things we may experience in this life or have been holding on to. I'm curious, for those listening who are curious about this healing space, as a therapist in training, we talk a lot about repressed memories and that dissociation and things we don't want to recall. I'm curious, for this healing space, how much of that you believe we need to resurface memories? We need to come to peace with it. What does that relationship look like?
Yeah, that's a really important question. And that kind of delves into, we talked about this a little bit the first time we spoke, therapy versus coaching. So I'm a spiritual life coach, which is really about addressing from the inside out. Where are you? What is your relationship with God, first and foremost? How can it be better? Where are you in your life? And where do you want to go? Right? The very important work of therapy is doing the deeper excavation, is going back into going, why am I the way I am? What happened to me that formed some of my opinions or some of my phobias or some of my things I want to work on?
Yeah.
And I think that it's important to know if and what happened to you to some degree. Sometimes those memories can never be retrieved, right? Sometimes there's enough protection, or it was young. It happened at a young enough age that it wasn't something that's cognitively accessible. But to be able to understand it and have the healing and compassion for that child that was robbed of their innocence, right?
Yeah.
Because to be sexually exploited as a child is robbing a child of our innocence. And truly, when we can stay in our innocence, we are connected to God. Right.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people who experienced that had to develop massive adaptive abilities to cope. Right.
Right.
And to process that, also deal with the shame, deal with the confusion of it, the betrayal of safety and, all the ways that plays out. For everybody who's dealing with that, do as much healing as you can to make peace with it. Forgive yourself. Right. Because there's often a lot of self-blame, which is a confusing aspect of it. But a lot of people feel like, but it felt pleasurable, but I didn't, stop it, or I didn't do enough, or whatever. All of us, I would argue, on some level have some kind of sexual trauma. And I don't even mean necessarily an event. I just think that there is so much collective shame, pain. We're not even aware of it. And so a lot of the work of mindfulness and meditation is starting to strip away the layers of conditioning that we all take for granted, that on many ways we don't even see. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's like,
it's felt.
We can be blinded by our peripheral vision. of the things that we're not even aware of that block us. And so when you can start to unravel those, you start to go, well, that isn't even something I necessarily agree with. And yet I've kind of gone along with it.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and also embrace our own hypocrisy. There are times that we are just hypocritical. We'll go, well, look at what they're doing. While, oops, I did that too, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's an opportunity to be more compassionate about ourselves, toward ourselves, about our hypocrisy, and go, yeah, like something I don't like in others, I have to look at in myself too.
Yeah. I'm hearing that a lot of self-compassion, grace in navigating this, understanding our limitations as humans and other humans' limitations. And that's that kind of forgiveness piece. And that seems like the foundational aspect. That's that healing work. That's your connection to God that you're cultivating, that you're growing, that you're stepping into in order to really have this healthy relationship with sexuality. And then it doesn't feel so restrictive. It doesn't feel so black and white, particular. It's this openness. It's this portal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And find a playfulness with sexuality that does come from a space of innocence.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's kind of reimagining that it doesn't have to be so serious, and that there's more room for reconsideration in flow of being in that state of like, what can we find here and what can we explore? And realize also that, like, when we talk about in Kundalini, right, Kundalini energy is the latent energy that every human being holds at the base of their spine. That is the portal energy that connects us to those higher states of being. And there are ways of raising that. And the more we experiment with that and learn to use it, I believe there is so much more that we can experience as human beings that maybe more indigenous shamanic peoples on the planet knew inherently that we've kind of lost the way to.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. I think a lot of these ancient practices are so powerful because as humans, we were a lot more connected to source. Something that we're touching on now with this playfulness in this space is something I just wanted to call out. I feel like labeling so much within sex is very challenging. I think for people to feel safe and identified is one thing, and that's really beautiful. It feels very stripped away from the essence that we're talking about now. It feels very definitive and fear.
Do you mean
driven.
Like sexual identity or
sexual? Preference and identity.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting time that we're in right now, because certainly we're coming out of a very closed, idea of like there's only male and female and that's it. And, gay is something that is not talked about or persecuted.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of fluidity around, what people are considering themselves or labeling themselves or finding their way to. Your point is more that it limits, or is that it's
well, I guess in studying it, something that I've been feeling is I almost feel sad that we have to come up with words for everybody.
Right.
And that it has to be like, let me just put this stamp on you so that we recognize you now. And it kind of takes this beauty away of this expression and this connection. And it's like, stick in that lane because that's how I know how to identify you.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of grasping at straws right now because we are in kind of this more open, there's masculine, feminine, and then there's this all different shades of kind of a middle sex, right? For lack of a better term. And then how do you identify that? How do you classify what your tendencies are or preferences or identification? On one hand, it's lovely that we're giving space for people who didn't feel like they had a place before.
I think without doing the healing work of what we're talking about with sex and just jumping to, well, let's just start to identify everything that we see. Let's give it a name. Let's give it a reason, a rationale, whatever.
I know where you're going with this. And I think what you're saying is it's like how religion or science tries to explain mystery, right? It's like we can put a label on it. We've got it all figured out. And the truth is, religion seeks to put a box around God, and we can't. There's no such thing. And it's our little human way of trying to explain something that's inexplicable, right? Science obviously is massively important, but it often evolves and changes. We think we've got it all figured out and we found the smallest particle, and then lo and behold, oops. Or we think we have space figured out, and then, so it expands in all directions. And so the thing about that is, part of being a limited, finite form is that we can't explain the infinite.
Yeah.
Right? And so we do the best we can with religion or science. But the truth is, the most powerful is being able to stay in the mystery. And that's the scary place.
Yeah.
Right? That most of the time we don't have it all figured out. And that's part of being human. And that's very true with our sexuality. That if we could be more expansive about it, what more could we find? And that's really the point of my podcast, is to explore what more is there in terms of the power of that atomic energy that we hold within us in the Kundalini form when we raise it, when we involve the heart center, when we have those kind of orgasms that are massively creating energy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I've had my Kundalini raise, not sexually, but in meditation, where I've literally felt like a heartgasm.
Wow.
Where it's just been so powerful. It brought me to sobs,
Wow. Yeah.
And that is what we all have within us. And I so deeply want more of humanity to understand that. I so deeply want more human beings to realize you are divine, and just let's bring heaven and earth.
Wow. I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing. I'm so grateful that I've crossed paths with you, and you're in my orbit now. And I'm so excited for the path that you're on with this, and the educational piece, but also really the exploration, and to have you doing this as we sit here and talk about the expansiveness. And it's this uncomfortable feeling to be in expansion, but you're ready to do this. You're open for it, and we really need you. And that's really special.
Thank you.
So really grateful.
And I echo that back to you. And truly, we find each other when we're on similar paths and we're doing important work. I really do believe the universe brings us together. But so we don't really have a choice, right? We have to expand, and we have to see the version of ourselves that's healed. In the same way that physics proves that the hypothesis or vision of the scientist or the experimenter doing the experiment directly affects the outcome of the experiment on an atomic level. What we expect for ourselves as humanity is what we will find, right? What we seek, we will find. And so we, as healers or teachers, coaches, whatever we want to show up as much as possible, that's part of the vision. When I'm working with a client, I'm holding a vision for them to get to. And sometimes that's all it takes, or somebody else to believe in it. And so I hold a vision for sexuality, for human sexuality, of healed, expansive, and connected to God.
Yeah, what a beautiful world that would be.
Right? And that's the Garden of Eden, right?
That's the Garden of Eden. That's the magic. I just see so much creativity and collaboration and love in that space.
Yeah.
So where can we find you? Where do we connect? How do we get more of you?
Thank you. My website, elizabeth-hudson.com, is the best ways to connect to me. I'm on Instagram at elizabeth.lydecker. That's Lydecker. And I'm on TikTok.
I'm on TikTok. Good for you.
But elizabeth-hudson.com.
Amazing. Amazing. And you're in LA. You do other workshops outside of the Astrogong ones, or mostly coaching?
I do retreats around the world.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So there's a few coming up that I'm in the works of creating, but I've done Bali, I've done Costa Rica, I've done Tulum, Australia, Hawaii, Ojai. I go to Ojai a lot.
Oh, no. Ojai is super spiritual.
Ojai's the best.
Yeah. I got to go back soon.
Yeah. I did a women's retreat with 30 women a week before the lockdown of the pandemic.
No way.
And thank God we were able to just get under the wire. Yeah.
Wow.
I know. But I love gathering people in consciousness. And
yes, I get that from you. Yeah, that's beautiful.
But it's what I love. I work on Zoom as well, but ideally in person is the best.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here and sharing your wisdom.
Thank you, Molly. And thank you for creating this forum to have these really important discussions.
Of course.
Yes.
Awesome. We did it.
Mm-hmm.